Less than 2 weeks before the COP27, the UN Environment Program released a report claiming that there's no credible path to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius. Average global temperatures are currently set to increase between 2.1 and 2.9 Celsius, given countries' current policies and pledges. This past summer, the US and China suffered from extreme climate change-related disasters, including record-breaking droughts, floods, and wildfires. How are civil society actors responding to these crises by driving innovation and policy changes to chart a path towards a more sustainable future? We're excited to have you join us for our conversation with our guest speaker, Clare Auld-Brokish. We'll unpack developing challenges environmental nonprofits are tackling, see how US-China relations and environmental policy intersect, and discuss how to navigate the sustainability sector as a young professional. Currently a program associate at the US Water Alliance, Auld-Brokish has previously worked for the National Resource Defense Council's Beijing office as a Princeton Asia Fellow and serves as a Fulbright Fellow in Yunnan. The US-China Youth Exhibition is an event series hosted by the Onero China program and the US-China Strategic Studies Organization that seeks to promote youth involvement in international affairs and research about US-China relations. Our moderator today will be Zach Rosenfield. Zach is a senior at George Washington University studying international affairs with a concentration in international economics. And he's the founder and former president of USCSSO. This whole event will be structured in two parts, a 45-minute moderated discussion and an open Q&A for the final 15 minutes. If you have any questions during the Q&A, please raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone to you. You can go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, George. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, amazing. So thank you so much for coming for our last Expo of the semester in our Youth Expo series between the USCSSO and the Onero Institute. Very happy to have Claire with me today as we're going to be talking about a really important issue, and that is sustainability, US-China relations, and going into a career where ultimately we want to do something good for the world. We're also interested in US-China relations and kind of all the issues that are happening right now in front of our faces. So we're going to go ahead and dive into our moderated question period. Please hold your questions for the Q&A that'll come at the end. And if you have them, write them down, keep them in mind, but it should be a very engaging discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. So we'll go ahead and get started and talking about water. So that's Claire's specialty and that's what she works in. And water security is one of the most important issues in environmental policy and one that I think we both agree isn't talked about enough. And it's surprising how little it's mentioned on the global stage. And this year, Vice President Harris announced the White House Action Plan of Global Water Security in response to new studies emerging saying half of the global population will experience severe water stress by 2030. Meanwhile, this past summer, the Yangtze River in China, which is the most important river in the country, providing fresh water to 400 million people, reached a record low water level due to widespread drought. There are plenty of pictures online where the river was almost completely dried up in points. It's very alarming. And this resulted in those spectacular images and ultimately affected hydropower, shipping routes, and drinking water access for millions. So Claire, what are the most important trends to look for when studying water security? And how does water stress affect US-China relations now and going into the future?
Yeah, I mean, hear me all right? I first want to thank Zach and Taffy and all of you at the US-China Strategic Studies Organization and the Onero Institute China program for having me tonight. You're right, water is my passion, but I agree it's not studied enough. And we need more water nerds in the world. But I think there's a reason that water isn't talked about in the way that energy policy or finance and economics are studied on the global stage. And it's because water is kind of the invisible force behind all of these changes. It's a visceral resource. It's something we need every day, and all life on Earth depends on it. But it's not something that we usually talk about or see, kind of in the sense of that U.S. water infrastructure is unseen. Like tap water, nobody really knows what happens before the water comes out of your tap. Nobody really knows what happens after it leaves your toilet.
Like we just accept. Right?
Yeah. We all just kind of accept that water is there until it's not. And so I think water is important because it's a threat multiplier. It's all of these crises that are happening, the social justice crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, are exacerbated by water. You think about the flooding and the droughts that are happening. That's because of climate change, but even if climate change was happening, water is kind of exacerbating the impacts on the people that are experiencing them in the environment. And so water, most importantly, exposes the fragility of our infrastructure, our energy infrastructure, our food and agriculture infrastructures. You know, the flooding that happens in China periodically every summer, the flooding that happens across the world increasingly is exacerbating issues with traditional power sources, coal-fired power plants. If they're flooded, they can't work. And the infrastructure, like our stormwater, wastewater infrastructures, if they're flooded, too often they lead to these overflows that produce like widespread sewer blowouts all over US cities. And so, and we're talking about drought as well. Drought happening in the United States West Coast, in China this year. I think I read an article in China Dialogue the other day that was talking about how hydropower and the big dams that are going up all over China, they don't work if there isn't enough water to go through them. And so that, especially in Sichuan, was really impacting the ability to provide energy through hydropower to their local and regional customers, as well as big cities like Shanghai and Beijing, because of the energy transfers that are happening. And so I think, especially with energy as like a case study, these climate change related floods and droughts and heat waves that are happening are exposing the ways in which we move power and generate power, and the ways in which it's flexible and not flexible and inflexible. And so I think we're going to see more movement towards demand side power, more investment in power storage. In 2020 or 2021, there were major blackouts across California because they moved towards solar heat and renewable energy, but the times in which people were demanding energy kind of condensed, and the intensity of the energy demand increased dramatically. And so they experienced massive blackouts because they didn't have enough energy during times when people were at home taking showers or trying to exist in their climate controlled environments. And so it's really interesting how water is not really at the cause of all these effects, but it is definitely an exacerbating factor and a result. And so talking about the future of water security and what work, especially in the water industry, I think we're going to see a lot more climate adaptation measures, things like green stormwater infrastructure, things that build the resilience of these traditional infrastructures like stormwater, wastewater. We're going to see more resilience in terms of adaptation to flooding and adaptation and resiliency to drought, like diversifying water sources through creation of new reservoirs. Like I think DC Water is doing one of those right now. Creation of new reservoirs, desalination efforts, ways to get clean, affordable water to people in ways that aren't impacted as intensely by climate change. And then I think we're going to see a lot of work in the equity and affordability sphere. It's something I'm personally attached to right now because of my work at the US Water Alliance. But I think as these climate issues intensify, it becomes more and more apparent that the social justice in America and across the world isn't working, or something isn't working with our systems, and the people who are most vulnerable, the people who are impacted first and worst, are being left behind. And so you can create good policy, you can create policy that's grounded in science, but without the policy or decision making that's tries to deliberately rectify these like historic inequalities in the way that we move water and the way that we supply water to people, and the way in which people we impact all of our policies and infrastructure impact people's quality of life. I don't think we can move forward without addressing some of that historic marginalization of really large swaths of the globe. And so equity is something that I'm working in the water sector. And that means a lot of things. It means providing people affordable water. The United States water industry and utilities are set up so that most of their funding comes from their customers and people who called their ratepayers, who turn on the taps and gets fresh water supply. And so there's kind of a battle happening right now between utilities who need to be paid to run their operations and people who are facing a lot of other different crises like the housing crisis, the COVID crisis, public health crisis. People are dealing with all these inequities, and they're kind of building in ways that prevent them from paying their water bill. And so what happens when you can't pay your water bill but you need water to survive? And so addressing inequities like that is something I think is a deep, very tangible aspect of water security. But also when you talk about water security, I also think about water conflict. But in traditional water conflict, as you would think about it, is maybe political instability or conflict, economic instability caused by lack of access to water or too much water. And I think a lot of the water conflicts are starting to appear already in the Middle East and Africa, but also on the flip side, I think I answered my own question, but the flip side, the water resource management, cooperation, watershed agreements are some of the most salient and long-standing examples of our environmental agreements. I think water deep down is a visceral issue, but it's also something that we can come together on in a really tangible way.
Great. Well, yeah, I think that touched on a lot of really interesting subjects. Thank you so much for going through that. I think some of the really interesting things that we brought up are, equity and affordability, I think is one of the most important things. And again, something that probably isn't discussed enough in the international affairs conversation. It's often about security politics and about energy and about making legislation and about conflict. And it's not as much about the actual people being affected. So we had 400 million people losing water access with the Yangtze River. And yearly, as you're talking about, water companies not being able to provide water because people can't pay their water bill because of all these other things that are happening, making it very difficult for individuals to live. So it's really interesting. It's a really important issue. And you also brought up political decision making. I know in one of our articles we talked about supplementing this event, the dams that China are building along the Mekong River area, where they're using water and maybe even cutting off water from other countries in South and Southeast Asia. And so it's very interesting in terms of both the effects of climate change on water and the political dynamics that are going into affecting the future of water. So thank you for touching on it. And now we'll transition to a little bit more kind of general sustainability questions. And as we opened up this event talking about COP27, which is the conference between global leaders on climate change that happens yearly, happened last year in Glasgow, and now it's going on in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, as we speak. And according to the website of the conference, their objective is to accelerate global climate action through emissions reduction, scaled up adaptation efforts, and enhanced flows of appropriate finance. Fairly general, if you ask me. As someone who is working in the industry, Claire, of climate policy, how much of an impact do you think this conference can actually have on global environmental policy?
I think a lot. I think even if the climate agreements aren't binding, and even if all of the countries aren't on board, they do set the tone and the agenda for the global conversation in ways that are really tangible, very effective. You think about the Paris Agreement that happened in 2015 and the US-China climate collaboration agreement that happened in the 11th hour and was able to push that through. That the Paris Agreement had a huge effect on innovation and investment and studies in the environment, in climate change. And even thinking about President Biden's executive order that he signed into law, that he signed when he first took office to rejoin or formally join the Paris Agreement. That had a huge effect on NGOs and people working in the space. It's the effect mostly to bolster their efforts and support their work, and say that this is important work and we need to invest in it. We need to learn more about it. We need to be, the United States needs to show up on the global stage in a way that is really evident. But I think COP is also this huge conference. It's thousands of people that come together, not just policymakers, but people representing NGOs, like NGO advocates, people who represent community groups in their own locale, scientists, people who work in research institutions and education. And so it's this global meeting point in which, even if the conversations aren't happening on the global stage or in a way that is on the front page of the New York Times, it's even the side conversations that are happening, like conversations in food and water and women and water, women in climate, equity and climate. Those conversations also have a real ability to lift up the importance of these issues in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be given the attention or the support that they would have otherwise without COP. But I also realized that I didn't answer your original question about US-China and water. I think speaking about COP27 and international agreements, yes, there's a lot of stuff happening between Xi Jinping and President Biden about coming back together on climate agreements and climate collaboration and talks. But there's also so much happening on the not federal, not national level that we need to lift up and recognize. Stuff happening in states. The US, the California-China Climate Institute is one of the biggest organizations that comes to mind on these issues. Traditionally, states between the US and China have collaborated on this kind of knowledge sharing, technical advice giving. It's really important for moving the work in both countries forward. NGOs that are working in China and the US and between the two countries are really formative, been really helpful in moving forward a lot of the wetlands work and the lower Yangtze River work, and even before the Paris Agreement in 2015, they were the people who were doing the bulk of the work to get China and the US together in the space that they could make that international agreement. And so I think there's a lot to be done, even if water security isn't an issue or isn't something negotiated between President Biden and Xi Jinping. It's something that's happening all around us by lower organizations and organizations that are doing the work on the ground.
Got it. Yeah. No, that's really great to hear. And I think we were just talking before we started the event about the amount of alarming language that we often use in talking about climate change and talking about COP27, and how, from a student perspective, it seems very out of our reach. But it seems like a lot of things are happening and a lot of people are coming together, whether it just be international leaders or smaller NGOs that you're saying. So that's promising, and that's really good to hear. And so we were just talking about US-China, and I think we'll say one more question on that before we move into another topic. And despite being at the start of your career, you've had the chance to witness environmental programs and kind of take part in how policies are enacted both in the US and in China when you're on your Fulbright there. So I'm curious from your experience, what the key differences between the American and the Chinese approach towards sustainability are.
Yeah, it's a good question, and really important for any kind of environmental work between the two countries. I think the difference lies in the political structure. China is an authoritarian political system, and so they rely very heavily on environmental authoritarianism. I think that there was recently a book published by Judith Shapiro and a colleague in NYU Shanghai about how China is leveraging this new kind of environmentalism and pushing forward environmental work that wouldn't otherwise be getting done in other countries that rely more on democratic systems. And so that looks like instances in which Xi Jinping puts forward a national mandate supporting formally EVs, electric vehicles, builds up the entire electric vehicle market through economic subsidies and support, and state level support. And then he eventually, like a year or so later, you start seeing EVs in the US, and China really has the wherewithal and the ability to make something happen very quickly through their endless supply chains and workforce, and to impact the rest of the world in the way we see vehicles in this instance. But on the other hand, this kind of environmental authoritarianism has the opposite effect sometimes, in ways in which dams along the Mekong are displacing people who've lived there for generations, and kind of overnight in these very top-down mandates. I was doing my Fulbright in Yunnan, and I had the opportunity to go up to Dali, which is kind of farther northwest than Kunming, which is the capital of Yunnan. And Dali is known as this tourist hub. It's known for Arhai, which is this really beautiful lake. And traditionally, Arhai, or historically in the last few generations, 2 decades, Arhai has experienced this intense eutrophication caused by pollutants in the form of nutrients and actual chemical pollutants that are entering its waters through the watershed, through agriculture, aquaculture, kind of people living along the lake and traveling to the lake to see it. And so in 2018 or 2019, there was a mandate, a local mandate, that in order to protect Arhai, they needed to demolish everything within 15 meters of the lake. And so you have these stories of people whose homes were chopped in half, or whose restaurants were just demolished. So their entire livelihoods, their entire lives were taken away in an instant, without their consent, without any kind of advance warning. And so that's what environmental authoritarianism looks like for the people on the bottom. The top-down system for the people on the bottom doesn't look so great. And so, yeah, I think there's this big push in China, this big recognition that the environment is a really important. Environmental work is very good work and very important work. I was studying at Yunnan University and had the fortune of meeting a lot of people, a lot of researchers who were doing environmental work on the Yanshi Lake, which is historically one of the top 10 most polluted lakes in China. And it's a great example of this authoritarianism, or this recognition of the environment as a really important aspect of Chinese life, in that the Chinese government saw this pollution that was happening in the 70s and 80s by this intense economic and physical infrastructure building around the lake. And they decided that they would invest a lot of research money into funding research and private sectors to solve this issue. And so environmental work isn't controversial in China. It's kind of in recent years, especially after the 2017 international NGO law that kind of cracked down on NGOs working in the country. It's authoritarianism without any kind of civil voice that's part of the political system. And so it leads to these instances where the government is making these big choices that impact a lot of people, but without their consent and without their feedback. But I also worked at NRDC with the Beijing office and was privy to their conversation, not their conversations, but I wasn't that high level, but I was privy to their work with the Chinese government. And I think one of the real indications that they play a real advocacy role with the Chinese government is that they're the head of programming, their CEO in that office, was previously a member of the Ministry of Environment.
Okay.
So NGOs, I think, have to play nice with the Chinese government, and they can still do their knowledge sharing, the kind of really impactful work that they do. They just have to do it in a really non-sensitive, non-threatening way. Whereas NRDC in the US is this kind of political watchdog. They're in the rooms with the president. They're in the environmental, the Council on Environmental Quality. But they're also in the front lines advocating against the policies that the government is producing. So NRDC kind of can take a more harsh role in the US in ways that they couldn't in China.
Interesting.
And I think that's an example that is kind of just the way that things are with a lot of NGOs. And yeah.
Got it. Yeah, no, that was really, really, really great. I appreciate your examples and kind of your firsthand experience seeing how environmental policy is leveraged in the US versus China. And speaking about the US, you do work at an environmental organization in the United States, the US Water Alliance. So I'm interested, now that you've gotten the chance to dive deeper into the solutions and actors in the environmental space domestically, you found unexpected industries that are very consequential. You've brought up utilities in our previous conversations, and I'm curious at your position in the US Water Alliance, with your role kind of existing between national policy making and local decision making and enforcement. What role does your organization and similar ones play in the enforcement, awareness, and construction of these policies? And also, how important is the utilities space, specifically in fighting climate change?
Yeah. I think maybe the theme of this conversation is that it's not all on the federal level. There's so much happening on the state and local levels, and by NGOs and private sector, and everyone is gathering their heads and on this issue, and it's really great to see. And so it just means that there's so many levers of power and ways to make a change and make a difference in the sustainability and environmental space. But yeah, the US Water Alliance, I think I was saying to you and Tappy when we met that I was a little surprised when I first came onto the Alliance team to learn that they worked primarily with utilities, and that their role wasn't so much to push forward policy or make policy. It was really to work as a middleman between utilities, which are dealing with their customers, people on the ground, and state and local policymakers and decision makers. And so, yeah, the US Water Alliance plays kind of a convening role in which we do a lot of knowledge sharing, which I've also learned is something that's really important in the environmental space, as in any industry. Like whole organizations like the US Water Alliance exist to bring people together in the same room, people who wouldn't necessarily talk to each other, and get them to realize that they're talking about the same things, just in different ways. And so I work on the Water Equity Network, which is a national community of practice among 33 representatives of 33 US states or US water utilities who primarily deal with stormwater and wastewater, but some of them are drinking water. And so we hold regional and national convenings that allow them to come together and share best practices, talk about what they're facing in terms of issues and what kind of solutions they've come up with. And I think that's the biggest value add of the US Water Alliance, in that it can bring people together in ways that spark productive conversation. And so the US Water Alliance on the climate side is also doing a lot of that work. We have a greenhouse gas emissions reductions cohort that's 10 utilities across the United States that are kind of coming together regularly to talk about ways in which they're reducing GHG emissions. We produced a report that was the product of the Imagination Challenge, in which we challenged the entire US water sector to think about how we're going to get to net zero emissions. And so thinking about that, thinking about the utility sector, that's the way, or that's the way we're influencing these climate issues, because I think the utility sector produces so many emissions through these kind of technological processes like drinking water, checking drinking water quality, and dealing with stormwater and wastewater in that. And so the utility sector has a big carbon footprint, and it has a big opportunity to really get to net zero emissions and affect our global climate goals. And so the Imagination Challenge was kind of 33 private organizations, utilities, and interested parties who came together to think about like the 10 best practices or the ways that we're going to get to net zero as an industry. And so I think that's really the value of organizations like the US Water Alliance. We're able to bring people together and drive this knowledge sharing and innovation in the sector.
Fantastic.
In ways that aren't just like research or
a little bit more
yeah.
tangible, as you were saying. I think a lot of the time it's tangible. It's bringing people together. It's happen.
It's both tangible and not tangible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we'll move on into our last section before we open the Q&A, and that's on your kind of individual career journey. So you're young, like a lot of us in this room, kind of starting off your career in the last few years. And most students here with an interest in US-China relations and in the Onero Institute and USCSSO kind of are interested in US-China relations and something else. So whether it be economics or politics or security studies or energy development or water, we kind of have these intersecting interests. And so how did you make water, kind of more generally environmentalism, pair with US-China relations and build into a career?
Yeah, I think one of the best pieces of career advice is to pair your interest in China with something in a way that makes you more valuable in the market and also more interesting as a person. And so I think there's not much to say other than that I did a lot of research. I thought deeply about what I wanted to do. I connected with alums from my college and people in the industry that I knew were doing really interesting work and work that I potentially wanted to do. And I talked to them, I explored all the options, and then I eventually chose the options to create a path that I wanted to take. And so things like the Fulbright, the Princeton Asia Fellowship were, as I saw it at the time, the only opportunities to continue along the environment China track. And so it wasn't so much a career decision as just this path that I had set forward for myself. and kind of a no-brainer. But I think if you're interested in China and the environment, or more generally China and anything else, your university is your best resource. Take all the classes you can in the topics you're interested in, and if you don't find a pairing that you like, or a class that covers the pairing that you want, find ways to make it happen. Find essay prompts and topic ideas that interest you, that you can kind of flip in the back door. Like, I took a politics in China class, and I wrote most of my essays on the environment in China, just because there weren't any other options for me, and I knew this is what I wanted to do. So
It's fantastic.
yeah,
That's really good advice. Yeah, I think it's tough, kind of, a lot of us going into career, especially at this school, is very like kind of go work in Congress, go work in consulting, do jobs that aren't necessarily catered towards, I guess, making the world better, to say it kind of blatantly. So I'm also curious, kind of, when balancing all these decisions going into a career, you know, you need to earn an income, you need to have a good place to live. How, even if your job necessarily isn't kind of dedicated towards sustainability or addressing some of these issues, how can you as an individual look at sustainability and look at kind of the climate crisis and make an impact?
I think the nature of our work, the nature of water, the nature of environmental issues is that they're all around us. And so do whatever you can at whatever level you can, in whatever capacity you can. Stay curious. I think stay flexible. There are opportunities to go down the path that you want in ways that maybe aren't linear or apparent to you at this moment. Like, even if life decisions take you in one direction, it's not the end of the line. There are opportunities that are maybe hidden to you at the time that may present themselves to you to enter into this work. Stay up to date, stay well read. I think if this is something you really wanted to do, if you really want to do it, just invest yourself in it in whatever capacity you can, with whatever time you can. My supervisor at NRDC once said that we need all hands in this work because the nature of the work demands it. Like, we talk about being alarming, but like, the climate, we're already in a crisis. We're in a climate crisis, we're in a biodiversity crisis. And the nature of our work demands that we stay in it, and stay optimistic about how we can make the world a better place.
Fantastic, yeah. And that was, we're just about over with our moderated session, but that was kind of building off one of the questions I had written down is how do we reason with the fact that it is an alarming crisis? We're in kind of all these multifaceted crises, and I think you said it perfectly. Just stay optimistic, do what you can, because we're in this now. We're in this situation, so there's not really much we can escape, but we just need to do what we can. But
yeah, and I think recognize and support and lift up the work of people who are doing it at any level that they are. I personally stay optimistic about all of this because I have some idea of what the field looks like, and it looks like a lot of really interesting people, really compassionate people working their hardest to make things work, make things better.
great. Well, it's very nice to end this section on a positive note, and we'll start the open Q&A. So we'll run around. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we can bring a mic to you. Otherwise, we'll discuss some further questions for the next 15 minutes, but we'd really encourage you guys to ask anything. Could be topic related, could be career related, could be anything.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for speaking with us today. Circling back to the conversation about authoritarian environmentalism, And back to what you talked about how top-down decisions often really hurt people at the bottom, and how people in China, especially on the bottom, don't really have a choice with a lot of these things. Do you think that the Chinese government at this time, especially with people being a lot more concerned about COVID-19 and economic slowdown, do you think there is an incentive for the Chinese government to encourage people to be caring about the environment at this time? And if so, how do you think they will be doing it?
I think that's a really great question. I think there maybe aren't incentives that are new now. I think they're kind of baked into the environment, into the framework in which Chinese society lives. I don't know if they're actual like campaigns to get people to care about the environment. I think it's happening, and people understand that the environment is something that we really need to protect and to work on. But maybe not on the national state level. I see like campaigns like the Ant Forests app that's happening with Alibaba, which incentivizes people to walk more and be more carbon friendly. Even at NRDC, there were like walkability campaigns and campaigns for it was zero carbon lifestyle. I think the campaigns that are happening to get people more involved in environmental work and being more environmentally conscious are happening, maybe not on the state level, but by NGOs and the private sector, just because this is important work, and I think the government knows it and everyone knows it. It's more about like getting people to change their consumer behaviors at this point, which is basically the only lever that Chinese people have for real change. And so you also see like the NGOs like IPE, which is responsible for a lot of data collection and sharing with the Chinese government, and it empowers citizens to submit complaints about like pollution happening in their area, and in kind of a way that it provides a platform for the government to come in and see these complaints, see what's happening with this pollution. Like by tracking the data, we know what's happening, and to make an effort to fix it in a way that's non-threatening. So I think a lot of like the citizen environmental NGO stuff is happening in more like the citizen science direction. It's getting people involved in providing the data or being more aware of what's happening pollution-wise in their area, and alerting the government or people who can really do anything about it, and instead of like political mobility. I hope that answers your question.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the tapestry of environmental work in China.
So that's one area where NGOs are like getting a space, kind of getting an opportunity to reach customers to a degree, which is
especially domestic NGOs. Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Okay, great. Well, before we wrap up, I'm just gonna ask if you have any kind of final things you want to say to the crowd after this discussion. Go for it.
There we go.
Oh, we have one more. Oh, perfect. Go ahead, Royce.
Now that you've had some time away from college, you've worked for a little bit. Do you have any advice for freshmen or other undergraduates about navigating their time here, be it socially, personally, academically?
Good question. Yeah, I'm about 3.5 years out, so I've had some time to think about my college experience. I think I really would have loved to have an organization like this at my college, one that talks directly about the issues that I'm interested in, and so
You're welcome back anytime.
yeah, I think I'd say go to more lectures, learn more about different things. One of my favorite things to do in college was to go to lectures about interesting niche topics like this, because it's kind of like a free learning session, free class without the homework. So you're just there to observe, you absorb all the information, and make connections that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise make. And so, yeah, I think other kinds of advice that I'd give to somebody just starting their college career. Develop relationships with your professors. It was hard for me. It's something I wish I'd done more, is just go to more office hours, talk to more professors about what you're interested in. Because those are the people that will stick with you. And really, even if it's not to write a recommendation letter at the end, it's to help you make connections that you wouldn't otherwise make, or support you kind of in any way they can throughout your career. So those are the people that stay with you, as well as your friends, but that's a no-brainer.
Fantastic. We have time for a couple more if anyone has more questions, but thank you, Royce. I appreciate it. That was a good question. Perfect. Okay, so now I'll say, is there anything final that you wanted to say after our discussion?
I think even though the situation is a little dire, there's a lot of cause for optimism, like as I was saying. And it's such a broad field that there's so many ways to get involved in it. And that's perfect, because we need all the hands we can get.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I also want to say one thing is that Claire is our first non-GW speaker to come speak at our event. So we're really happy to be branching out. Thank you so much for being a part of this. We're really excited. I think this was a really interesting discussion. I hope you all took away something from this and learned a little bit. I know I certainly did, but George, you can take us away now.
This will conclude our event today, and I would like to thank our guest speaker, Claire, and moderator, Zach, for this thorough and educational discussion. I'd also like to thank each individual member of OICP from the Onero Institute and the USCSSO, for they have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. Last and foremost, I would like to thank all the audiences for listening and engaging with our discussion today. And thank you, Rob, for setting up this whole setup, and thank you, Howen, for helping us with our questions today. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Onero Institute.
Of course.